You may have noticed when playing video games that there are sometimes moments where you knew exactly what to do or where to go without the game telling you. Or maybe you haven't, but don't worry, that's kind of the point. Video games have developed a multitude of ways of guiding their players through their content, and these methods can have a huge impact on your experience while playing the game. They allow the developers to nudge the player in the right direction and also communicate important information to the player to help them progress. One incredibly important technique for achieving this is the use of affordances. Taken from Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things, an affordance is a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the agent that determine just how the object could possibly be used. To put it simply, an affordance is when you can assume what something is for, or what it affords, just by looking at it. The best example for this is a door. If a door has a handle like this, it affords pulling because the natural human response is that the shape, position and other things make it seem like the handle would be easy to pull. If it has these metal plates on it, it affords pushing because it looks like a natural place to put your hands and push on. An example of affordances in games can be in Pokemon and other RPGs where water is super effective against fire, as this can be reasonably assumed and understood by the player. The same goes for when there is lava or fire, and the player can expect it to be dangerous or harm them in some way. Well, most of the time.
Hey.
But those are usually due to oversights in insignificant instances. Now, that was affordance, which is the natural reaction and understanding we have with objects. However, sometimes affordance alone is not enough to communicate the interaction with an object, and this is where signifiers come in. Signifiers signal to the users more directly the way we intend for them to interact, or give information about the nature of an interaction. Going back to the doors from earlier, they sometimes have signs on them depending on which side you are looking at that say push or pull. You see the sign, and its presence signifies that the object is to be used in a certain way. Signifiers aren't just literal instructing text, however, as they can be all sorts of things from shapes, colours, symbols and more. A famous gaming example is Mirror's Edge and its trademark runner's vision. This feature would highlight all of the upcoming obstacles that the player is intended to traverse in order to get through the level in a striking red which contrasts with the common sterile whites of the environment. The obstacles already afforded being traversed through ways such as their placement and shape, but the red from the runner's vision signifies and confirms to the player that this is the right obstacle to traverse. Signifiers are like an extra complementary signal to the player that builds off of affordance, which narrows the focus and helps distinguish important things from the environment. With that said, I wanted to take a look at a specific game and note the different ways that it guides the player. I do this in the hopes that I am able to highlight how prevalent and important these guiding methods are, as well as to bring them to the attention of others in a digestible way so that they may be able to use this understanding in their own ways. The game I wanted to look at is the original Half-Life. Half-Life was chosen due to its almost sacred position amongst first-person shooter games, which I believe makes it an excellent subject for this case study. I'll get into the specifics of why I chose Half-Life later on in this video, but for now just know that I am very familiar with it and have considered many factors when choosing it. I wanted to focus down my approach, and for that reason I'll be focusing on mainly the early parts of the game. Now, how about we get right into it and talk about what is considered by many to be the birth of the modern shooter. That's right, we're talking about Created by Valve in November 1998, Half-Life was subject to critical acclaim from the get-go, boasting near-perfect review scores from gaming sites. It innovated on the first-person shooter genre in many ways, implementing new and exciting technologies and techniques that really rocketed it ahead of anything else released at the time. This is one of the reasons I decided to look at Half-Life, as its position as the pioneer of modern shooters makes it an interesting subject to analyse in the area of game design that I'm focusing on in this case study. Now, why don't we go and have a look at the game? When you start the game, you are confined to a tram rail, soaring through different parts of the facility until you come to a stop. And hey, looky there, There's already a guiding method the instant the gameplay really starts. NPCs can be a really effective tool for guiding the player through the game. They can spout exposition and context as well as instructions for the player to follow. And this is all done diegetically, which is important for immersion as it comes across more naturally than if a game were to tell the player explicitly what to do with flashing text and arrows for every little thing. Like, say, following them and walking over to this door like this kind man right here does. Then, straight after that, we get into a building and run over to the person at the desk, and they tell us,
"They told me to make sure you headed down there as soon as you got into your hazard suit."
"Why thank you, I will." So, I make my way down the halls and then I get to here. Whoa! What a cool suit! Ah, right. The game never told me what the interact button is. But wait, it did! In the manual! Let me just... Yeah, so Half-Life came out in the time where people were actually expected to read the manuals that came in their game boxes, before they started becoming obsolete and more of a novelty, until even more recently where they oftentimes are not included at all. Video game manuals back in the day really were a crucial way that games partly relied on in order to guide the player and teach them important things about the game. In some cases, they were downright mandatory for the player to be able to play the game. Usually in 80s or 90s adventure games like King's Quest III for example, where the player must read the manual in order to learn the recipes for the spells that they can create. In the Half-Life manual, it has a bunch of useful stuff like information about weapons, the different kind of enemies, settings, and controls. Ah, here we go. Use the E key for all sorts of other activities including activating doors, switches, and buttons. Nice. Now that they've bestowed this knowledge upon me, I think it's pretty clear what they want me to do.
My God, what are you doing?
Anyway, I need to go and interact with a console, because a console that is placed in front of something that's locked affords being able to unlock that thing. The same is true for all the random objects I just went around interacting with, as they all afforded being used in some way that I can reasonably expect an interact button to prompt. Another big reason why I noticed it was because the game made it stand out and catch my eye by having a bright green and yellow symbol while next to two more dull looking red symbols. This idea is backed up by a nut when they talk about how the bright blue and orange portals in the game Portal, in contrast to the low saturated environments, provides clear interaction points. It being the odd one out makes it stand out as well as making it clear that we need to interact with that one. We as humans tend to have our eye drawn to shiny things, especially when they are surrounded by not shiny things, to make the shiny things stand out even more, which the idea of negative space in graphic design hinges off, as empty space directs attention by diverting it. Now that we're suited up, we go talk to some scientists, do some shenanigans in the reactor core blows up, and we are making our exit away from the disaster area. We approach a door and see a crowbar on the ground, so we go and pick it up. Ah, nice. Anyway, let's go and get out of it. Huh. The door won't open. If only there were another way to get through. Ah! Smashy smash time. This was an example of another technique that gets used in games, where they use the convenient placement of tools and objects to try and lay out what the player is supposed to do. The crowbar affords smashing, and the glass affords being smashable. Crowbar next to glass door that won't open? Smash the glass and hop on through. Glowy green button on a console that's overlooking a locked suit of armor? You best believe I am smashing that button as hard as I can. The game presents you with the pieces of the puzzle and they're like, come on, you know what we want you to do. It's sort of like when you're playing Pictionary with your friends and you have to keep circling things and drawing arrows to try and spell it out as much as possible without straight up giving them the answer. We then need to break another glass door, which reinforces to the player that, look, this isn't a one-off thing. Another example of this is later on where you can climb up this ladder and see a group of enemies next to what appears to be gas canisters with a bright red sign saying danger. The canisters afford being filled with gas, and the sign is a signifier that confirms to the player that these canisters will explode if you shoot them. A classic example that is seen in a plethora of shooter games. Going through the glass will then trigger one of the aforementioned innovations that Half-Life jumped the gun on, being scripted events during gameplay. An elevator comes crashing down the elevator shaft, leading to the player needing to use this very visible bright red ladder to get up. A scripted event is when a certain scene plays out once the player has activated a trigger by meeting certain conditions. Most commonly, said trigger is the player moving into a specific space in the level, almost like they are triggering a tripwire. This elevator example triggers once the player moves through the glass, which then prompts the game to begin playing the scripted sequence. Once up the ladder, another scripted event plays, to show a ghoulish zombie-like creature lurching towards a security guard who promptly starts shooting it. This encourages the player to start attacking it because it has a generally ghoulish and bloodied appearance and has been shown as hostile to the friendly NPC security guard. Next, the player walks down these hallways until they turn the corner and an explosion comes from one of the vents on the wall, leaving a crouch-sized hole in the wall. The game relies on the scripted event here in order to guide the player in more natural and interesting ways. While not all scripted events are made to guide the player, they certainly can be used as such and are an exciting, dynamic way of doing so. However, they do come with their issues, mainly being that, because their goal is to be seamless and melded so closely with play, the player is unrestricted as they would be in a traditional cutscene. This causes a lot of problems for the developers as they need to make sure the player is looking at the right spot, otherwise they may completely miss the scripted event. In the Half-Life 25th anniversary documentary, while on the topic of scripted events, animator Dog Wood mentioned that most people weren't looking at the right place anyways, so you'd have to get their attention with a particle or a sound or lighting or something. You can see the use of these techniques listed with this vent sequence, as there is an explosion sound as well as a particle effect emanating from the vent which immediately draws the player to pay attention to where the developers are trying to guide them towards. More subtly, there is a blood trail leading around the corner and a scientist's body at the same eye level as the vent. All of these things combine together to attempt to guide the player as well as possible while still feeling natural. Another way they ensure the player is able to see the scripted sequences unfold as intended is through their placement in relation to the level design. While it is not mandatory for a scripted sequence, all three of these ones mentioned now, as well as many more, take place while the player is going through a door or hallway, which generally forces the player to be looking in that direction and thus they will view the scripted sequence take place. An important guidance technique, especially for the early parts of the game, is what I'm going to call the show and tell method, and it utilizes scripted events in order to execute it. The show and tell method is when there is a scripted sequence that shows off a mechanic in a way that does not involve the player immediately, so that they have a safer environment to learn in, so as to not feel like an unfair surprise on the player. I'll give you an example. When you get through this door, there is an alien dog on the other side of the room looking at something off screen. It makes a loud noise to draw the player's attention and then lets out a shockwave before it appears to chase after something. This acts as an introduction for this alien type and shows off what it does without putting the player in danger. Right after, there are a bunch of green lasers that show up and then another one of the dogs spawns in. This acts as a way to teach the player that the green lasers signify an enemy spawning, as well as to let them have a go at fighting the enemy themselves. After this encounter with the dog, you might have lost some health, but that's no problem, because literally right before the dog section, there is a scripted sequence that teaches the player about health stations. The player walks up to this hallway and they hear gunshots coming from the other side, which alert them to hurry down the hallway, and then a monster dying against a wall can be seen, and to the left is a wounded guard on the floor reaching for the health station. This works well as a natural way of teaching the player, as they can infer that fighting the monsters will result in you losing health, and that the solution to this is the health stations, which they know from the guard trying to reach it. They are also able to understand the purpose of the heal station, due to the affordance of a red cross meaning first aid. The cross itself acts as a signifier to show that this item is a healing item and will heal you. Another instance of show and tell was later on, where the player crawls through the vent and then can see a scientist running away from something. However, he runs into the line of fire of a turret and it targets and shoots him. This clearly communicates to the player, these turrets will shoot anyone who walks in front of them, and it does so without putting the player in danger so they don't get a cheap death from something they couldn't anticipate. I want to take a moment now to talk about the way that the level layout and affordances that come along with it influence and guide the player through the game. One of the simplest ways for games like this to guide the player is to block parts of the level off. If a player obviously can't go a certain way, they're just going to go off and try a different way. Why do you think there are so many corridors in Half-Life? They are a very effective way of getting the player straight to where they need to be. However, these can feel quite boring and repetitive if they are the only thing the game has, And that's why it's important to get creative with how you guide the player so that the game doesn't have to make the surrounding areas boring and uninteresting, just to make sure the player goes the right way. Let's look back at the vent that exploded near the beginning. The player is first blocked off from an area by a pile of rubble, which leads them to go down the path that causes them to see the vent explosion. When the player goes through the vent, they get into a room that has been wrecked with toppled cabinets all over the room. The only way out besides the way we got in is another vent hole at the top of the wall. And say, is it me or does that fallen cabinet look like a ramp going straight up to where I need to be? The way this cabinet is angled affords being able to walk up it like a ramp, and there's even 2 other cabinets laid flat on the ground so the player can use them in order to more reliably get onto the angled cabinet. This one has a little step which affords climbing onto. Fast forward a bit and there is a section with an electrical wire that is sparking and hanging in the way of the place the player needs to go, which even sends out a mini explosion as they get closer, which acts as a warning. The player can interpret that the electrical wire affords harm and thus will look for a new route, lest they try to brave the wrath of 10,000 volts. The game makes good use of the lighting in this instance, as the corridor is mostly dark, but you can see a glow from the vent which draws the player's gaze, setting them up to figure out that they are supposed to break the vent and go through there instead. The explosive bolt of electricity that comes from the wire further reinforces the attempt to get the player to look at the vent, as the place where it strikes is right next to the vent and will cause the player to look in that area. In this section, there is a bridge, and as the player approaches it, the green laser sparks show up again over the bridge. Now, these laser sparks already somewhat afford danger, but thanks to the dog section from earlier, the player knows that it signifies enemies spawning. Knowing this, the player will be cautious and wait in anticipation. This allows the scripted sequence to play out properly, and it shows a dog falling onto the bridge and causing part of it to break off. Now that the player's original clear path is shown to no longer be an option, the player will look for another route. And if we look slightly to the right, those pipes stand out a fair bit with their light grey colour contrasting against the grimy brown walls. And they also look like they could be used as a platform to walk on, judging by that wide ledge they are making right next to where I can jump from. Additionally, once on the pipes, there are many small gradual raises in elevation which afford being climbed up, similarly to the cabinet seen earlier. All these factors combine to make the path actually noticeable by the player by conveying to them that this is actually an option, compared to if the factors were absent, which would result in most people not understanding that it was in fact a path. Half-Life has a lot of subtle tricks to make sure the player is able to experience the game in the intended way. Most of the time, players are able to tell what to do and how to do it when playing. However, due to the emphasis on immersive guidance and a lack of direct and non-diegetic guiding elements, it can pose issues for some players. Duolingo's senior engineer Karen Tsai mentions the use of the utterly screwed test, which asks if a player was dropped into a random point in the game, would they be able to navigate their way through to the goal? Players that hadn't played the game in a while may get a bit lost if they came back to Half-Life and loaded up their previous save. And this can, in my opinion, be attributed to the seamless transition between levels, the freedom to save at any time, and the lack of explicit guiding methods like waypoints or mission objectives. Some first-person shooter games released after Half-Life, like Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Call of Duty Black Ops 2, make use of those explicit guiding methods mentioned to good effect, as well as many more which could be interesting to compare and contrast to Half-Life. However, that is best saved for another video. So, what do we learn from this video and the case study that I conducted? Well, for starters, we know the importance of affordances and signifiers in games, as they are crucial for players to understand what they can actually do in a game, as well as the fact that they can both come in many different forms, like text, sound, colour and more. The importance of NPCs, as well as scripted events, and the convenient placement of objects was made abundantly clear. This is especially true in the way of influencing the player to experience certain set pieces in the way the designers intended for the player to play out. And we can't forget about how the game guides us down certain paths through different methods like level design, eye-catching colours and effects, and dialogue, to name a few. The need to guide the player is a subtle but crucial part of game design, and a technique that must be mastered if developers want to ensure that players get to experience the game the way it should be experienced. The effectiveness of guiding methods, as well as how well suited they are to the audience, can have a big impact on the experience of a player, and I hope that this video has highlighted that fact. I wanted to make a resource about this topic that was interesting, digestible, and entertaining, and I hope that everyone watching feels that it was as such. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.